MDL power! Como dirá, MDL power!
Why didn't the world react? That is a question that's almost as difficult to answer as why did Rwandans engage in the killing? Because the evidence was so clear. The argument that people didn't know, particularly at the highest levels of governments, that as Clinton told the Rwandans, your voices didn't penetrate into my office. That's not true. They knew. We know now from intelligence records just how much they knew, that within hours they were aware that the killing was being done on an ethnic basis, systematically, that there were lists, that the killers were going through the capital city, choosing out people from certain households and executing them. They knew this.
We saw bodies along the road, and we saw people being led off, and we saw people being, and this is not something we could stop and look at, of course, but we would see it happening, and then we would look through the rearview mirror and turn around and see this happening on the side of the road. The kind of hacking motion of people who were being killed.
People had the impression that this was tribal warfare, that this was a repeat of something that had gone on forever, for centuries, and none of that was true. What was true was that this was a genocide fully as modern as the Holocaust, in the sense that it was state-organized and state-driven. At least 500,000 people were killed, and they were killed in 100 days. Does it have to be 800,000? Does it have to be 1 million to cross the threshold of horror? Isn't 500,000 enough?
For many people, all of a sudden the plane went down, with 2 presidents, and then this horrific and unspeakable violence started happening. But it didn't happen in a vacuum.
The genocide was touched off by the shooting down of the airplane of President Habyarimana. That happened at about 8:23, I think to be exact, on April 6, 1994. Within hours, there was an exchange of diplomatic cables between those countries most involved in Rwanda, that is the US, Belgium, and France, and the UN. And it's clear from looking at those cables that these decision makers already knew that people were being killed. They were being killed on a systematic basis and on an ethnic basis. There was a reaction on the part of everyone, and it was get the hell out of there. The fastest possible evacuation for citizens of these countries and for a substantial part of the UN peacekeeping force was the reaction. So it wasn't that there was no reaction, it was rather a reaction which stimulated and encouraged the carrying forward of the genocidal killing.
Because they were African, because people didn't understand them, because of a certain devaluation of the African experience and African suffering. I think that clearly has to do with it, as well as that the international community not wanting to take the risks or take on the responsibilities of something like that. But I think clearly there was a sense of racism.
Tootsie means literally is someone who's powerful, someone who's rich. And Hutu means literally a person who is someone else's follower or servant or client. These terms originally were applied to people. Someone is a Tutsi, someone is a Hutu, right? They were not groups as such. But as Rwanda became a powerful state, an elite developed, and that elite became known as Tutsi. They were the people in power. And the great Hutu majority, the 85%, 90% even of the population, were more or less excluded from that opportunity to rule. This was the situation that existed during the colonial period. Partway through the colonial period, the colonial administration decided that it was in their interest instead to try to give more power to the majority. This then caused a revolution, and the people who held power, the Tutsi, all of a sudden became the people who had no power. The Hutu became the power brokers, and the Tutsi, the former rulers, became an elite that was discriminated against.
What was striking about it was kind of the whole low-tech nature of it. This was a genocide that was not perpetrated with machine guns and gas chambers. I mean, these were machetes and knives and clubs. And that with the quick and rapid deployment that was our obligation as the international community, we could have actually stopped this thing.
Radio is the most important form of communication in Rwanda. So people had the habit of expecting what came from the radio to be authoritative, to be actual instructions from the government. Sometime before the genocide, a few months before the genocide, a small private radio got started and took off. Very lively, very interactive. So this private radio began to incite people to killing. And when even beyond that, when the genocide got started, to give specific directions. For example, there's one case I know of a man called Nsenguyinka, whose children were traveling, trying to flee on a city street in Kigali, when one of the announcers on RTLM came on the air and said, "Aha, you people at the barrier, lycée des Citeaux, you must stop the red vehicle that's heading towards you with license plate number so-and-so and so-and-so because it's full of cockroaches." Inyenzi, which was the code word for Tutsi and RPF supporters. And half an hour later, she came on the air again and she said, "Congratulations to the people at the barrier of Lycée des Citeaux. They've gotten rid of all of them."
When I was interviewing these militiamen from this one checkpoint, I asked them, and I said, there are a lot of accounts of a lot of killing going on and of massacres going on. I didn't use the word genocide, but I used the word massacres, of Tutsi going on. Now, is this true, and how can you explain it, and so on and so forth. I got the predictable answer of denial, as well as explaining that, in fact, it was the Tutsis who were actually planning to massacre the Hutu.
It's important to make the link between what happened even at that very lowest grassroots level and what was happening here in New York or at the UN or in Washington or Paris or Brussels. The failure to call the genocide by its rightful name was certainly part of what made the government able to pretend this was legitimate. They used that legitimacy to say to the people of Rwanda, you see, everyone understands what we're doing. They know it's a legitimate exercise in self-defense.
Part of the job of Human Rights Watch is to report on these underreported conflicts and to create a sense of moral outrage, which is appropriate, to get people interested, to get people to identify through the voice of the victims and the witnesses with what they're suffering, and to create a sense of moral outrage and hopefully then beseech upon the international community and key actors responsibility to intervene.
Having the connection with Human Rights Watch gave me the platform that allowed me to use my information to bring it directly to the policymakers. We now know, we didn't know at the time, but we now know how effective that was. We went to Senator Kennedy, for example, at one point to say one of the most effective things that the U.S. could do would be to jam radio RTLM. This would have, first of all, interrupted the flow of information so that orders weren't given to stop the red car at the barrier. But it would also have immediately shown that this government and its message was, in fact, illegitimate. It would not have required any U.S. troops. It could have been done by airplane. So Senator Kennedy took this idea, and we know that it was followed through all the way to the highest ranks of the Pentagon, because we now have the documents showing the chain of that. So the idea got there, it got forward, but At the Pentagon, they decided that $8,000 an hour was too much to spend. So they decided not to do it. The legacy of the Rwandan genocide. It's as if you took a picture of a family and ripped it down the middle, and then tried to fit the halves back together again. Even with the best glue in the world, it's never going to be the same. People betrayed their deepest values in order to kill, in order to rape, in order to pillage their friends and neighbors and their own family members. Whether you look at it from the point of view of the victim or the point of view of the perpetrator, these are not things that can ever be forgotten.
These underreported, kind of unseen conflicts don't come out of nowhere. There's usually decades that proceed of often nepotism and corruption and bad governance and inequitable distribution of resources that create a population of very frustrated, desperate individuals, particularly young men, who often take up arms to try to redress some of these problems. And what starts off as kind of bad governance and corruption ends up in war crimes.
Justice is not going to erase the memory of the crimes, but it will provide people with some level of closure. At least they'll know it has been dealt with, it has been talked about, someone has been held responsible, and perhaps even ideally, the victim has received some form of compensation. So this is very important. It's very important that the truth be known, that the people who were killed be remembered, and that their killers be acknowledged.